You have to laugh, really. You're having back-to-back parties in Chequers to thank your loyal staff over the last 44 days. She probably didn't even have time to learn their names, or maybe Tories don't bother with the names of the domestic staff. Back-to-back parties suggests she's got a lot of friends, but it didn't feel like that during the catastrophic, calamitous, shortest in all British history tenure as Prime Minister. In Liz we trust. Do you remember those mugs? They're now going cheap, I bet, in a remainder store. You couldn't make it up. It's obvious, or should have been. I certainly warned everybody long and loudly enough that this woman was completely out of her depth as Prime Minister at any time, never mind a time as tumultuous as this, where we face existential challenges on the economic, on the political, and who knows, according to the Russian defense minister in the last hour, maybe even on the military front. The truth is, we need a Churchill 1940. We got Liz Truss instead, who would have been a tea lady in Downing Street at the time at best. And now we've got Mr. Sunak from Accounts and Mr. Johnson vying for the premiership. We'll be talking to Professor Sir John Curtis, the prince of psephologists, the prince of pundits and pollsters, in the first part of the show, to get the runners, riders and latest prices and to analyse what it all might mean for us. But here's my tuppence worth. If Boris Johnson does have 100 nominees, then he is a shoe-in as the returning Prime Minister, making him a comeback king comparable to Muhammad Ali's return in the rumble in the jungle against George Foreman in Zaire all those decades ago. No one could come back as Prime Minister after the humiliating exit that he made, other than Boris Johnson. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, and I have to keep doing this because so many people don't listen to what I'm saying properly. I think that Boris Johnson is a liar, a cad, a mountebank. He has lived now a long life as an imposter, as a liar, as a cheater, as a deceiver, on every level, deceiving his families, deceiving his employers, deceiving his party members and all the rest. But he will win the Tory leadership for this reason. He, despite all the monkeys he has on his back, despite all the skeletons in his various cupboards, in his various residences that he has maintained, though probably not paid the rent on, throughout his long and public career, despite all the crosses he has to bear, he has what the French call je ne sais quoi. I don't know what. It's a quality, and in politics it is vital. John Major didn't have it, which is why he eventually crashed out of power. Margaret Thatcher did have it. Tony Blair did have it. Gordon Brown didn't have it. It's something you cannot learn. You either have it or you don't. Call it stardust, call it charisma, call it a popular touch, call it whatever you like. Boris has got it, and Mr. Sunak from Accounts, despite having hundreds of millions of pounds in his pocket and billions in the purse of his wife, simply doesn't have it. That's the long and the short of it. Why does that matter? It matters because members of Parliament, like the man who is to be hanged in the morning, have their mind concentrated wonderfully by the possibility that they might be ex-members of Parliament. I sat in the British Parliament for nearly 30 years. There is nothing as an ex-member of Parliament. Trust me, It's good work. It's clean. There's no heavy lifting. The carpets are thick, the upholstery mellow, the catering wonderful at 1970s prices. It's steady work for 5 years on pretty decent money with a more than decent pension. No member of Parliament wants to leave it. That's why they stay in the parties they're in, even though they increasingly hate the parties that they're in, because they know that outside that party they would be hard pushed to be elected. Very few people can be elected on their own name, on their own standing. I'm one of the very few who's done so, not once, but twice. But there are very few of us who can do it, put their name on a ballot paper, sometimes in a place, in my own case, in two entirely new places, in which I'd scarcely set foot 3 weeks before, but was, in the case of Bradford West, elected in a landslide. There are not many who can do that, and not many willing to try. So, for the members of Parliament, what counts is who will keep their seat. That's why Boris Johnson has now passed 100 nominations. And having now got himself on the ballot, he will win by a landslide. Not just for the aforementioned reasons, but because, as I keep saying, most Tory party members think that we should still be ruling India, not that an Indian from accounts should be ruling us. Boris Johnson, blonde hair, blue-eyed, full of idiomatic English that ironically is more often spoken in India now than it is in England, he is the man the Tory party will pick, because the Tory members know that the opinion poll in the Daily Mail, an exhaustive one, a very large one, on which I'll speak to Professor Sir John in a minute, showed that under Sunak, the Tories lose by a staggering 26 percentage points. Under Boris Johnson, now they lose by just 10 percentage points. The difference between an absolutely annihilating landslide and being in a fighting position between now and the general election in order to recover that lost ground. There's a third reason, or is it fourth? The fourth reason is this. The Tories could not morally, as Zach Goldsmith, Lord Goldsmith, just pointed out on Twitter minutes ago before I came on the air, the Tories cannot morally, and therefore politically, sustain a case for a third new Prime Minister, all based on a mandate won by a Prime Minister that they sacked. In other words, a new Prime Minister, Mr. Sunak from accounts, would have to call an early general election. Boris Johnson returning to the job does not so require a general election because he already has a mandate. He won it with a big majority, 80 parliamentary constituencies, including seats never won by the Conservatives before in 100 years, and unlikely ever to be won by any Conservative other than Boris Johnson in the future. So, notwithstanding my caveats about the beastliness of Mr. Johnson, he is the obvious candidate for Prime Minister, and I believe that next week he will complete that comeback like Muhammad Ali knocking out George Foreman. In the latter case, I experienced epiphany. In this case, I will simply, merely, and quickly return to remorseless, unremitting attack on the bounder, the cad, the mountebank, Boris Johnson. I'm just telling you what I think is going to happen. Of course, I could be wrong. Boris could be lying, though it wouldn't be like him, would it? He might not have 100 MPs, but all of his closest aides in the last hour or so are saying that he does. And if he doesn't, it's not just him that will never be able to show his face in politics again. It's his allies that have very publicly supported him. People like Jacob Rees-Mogg and others who are openly stating that there is going to be a contest. He met in a kind of Tory granita moment. I don't know what would be the Tory equivalent of the granita. The harvester, perhaps, out in the country, wearing brown shoes and corduroys. That might be the way the Tories do it, at least those in that elite class that both Sunak and Johnson belong to. So in their harvester moment, they met for 3 hours last night. They failed to reach agreement. That could only be because Sunak thought that Johnson couldn't get the 100 nominations. Because now that he's failed to do the deal, Sunak is bound for California. There's absolutely no future for Rishi Sunak in British politics if, having failed to do a deal with Boris and then lost heavily in any ballot, it's curtains for Sunak, or new curtains in Malibu rather than the ones he was currently imagining in number 10 Downing Street. Jeremy Hunt will continue as Chancellor of the Exchequer so as not to frighten the horses and the markets. Penny Mordaunt, if she does a last-minute deal with Boris, would be a passable Foreign Secretary. And after all, we haven't had very high standards in that post in recent times. Go back and look at who they were. Now, viewing politics in Beijing, by comparison, looks serene, absolutely stable, and these two things cannot be separated from China's burgeoning political and economic success. I know you don't want to hear that. As President Francis Urquhart put it, sotto voce, looking off camera, democracy, it's so overrated. Democracy has given us Joe Biden and Liz Truss. The lack of democracy in China is, of course, a relative matter. In Britain and in the United States, you can change the party, but you cannot change the policies. If a leader of a major party emerges who doesn't accept the pro-imperialist, neoliberal economics that are the prevailing orthodoxy in the Western democracies, they will be destroyed ruthlessly, if necessarily with extreme prejudice. As Jeremy Corbyn might be actually relieved he never had to find out. You cannot change the policies in Western countries, but that you can change the policies in China is self-evident. China's policies are simply incomparable to those that went before. Xi Jinping is presiding over a China that is something of a political and economic miracle. It is neither wholly socialist nor wholly capitalist. It is something written in Chinese characteristics. It cannot be compared to anywhere else. And his paramountcy as the political leader has just been confirmed. In the last couple of hours, he is about to embark on a third term, unprecedented third term as China's leader. Of course, most Western media outlets, when they cannot ignore what's happening in China, lie about it instead. It's only, after all, about 3 weeks ago that the entire social media blogosphere, the entire mass media in the West was telling you that there was a military coup taking place in Beijing. They showed pictures of God knows what it was supposed to be, A column of military vehicles, they said, headed for Beijing, even though any cursory reading of the street signs showed that they were heading away from Beijing. They showed you pictures of the military officer who was to be the new president of China. Today, it is Hu Jintao being dragged out of the Congress Hall, where he was sitting right next to the leader of China, and this was portrayed as the old fellow being dragged out, when in fact the man is suffering, just like Joe Biden, from exactly the condition that Joe Biden is suffering from. Premature senility, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, call it what you will. Hu Jintao was helped into the Congress Hall and placed in his seat by exactly the same stewards who then came on to lead him off the stage, because the old fellow can't make it on his own. As far as I know, he doesn't have the same toilet troubles as Joe Biden, and the Chinese don't allow their retired leaders to shake hands with empty space or caress the hair of little schoolgirls on camera. The Chinese have rather more dignity than that. So the Melbourne Age, the New York Times, you're talking through your hat, if not your ass. You are an idiot, if not a liar, when you claim that this was some coup taking place, because a man in his 80s was assisted from the podium by the same stewards that assisted him into it. Now, only time for a very brief mention about the war. It's all going very badly. And as General Winter approaches, it seems ready to get much worse. The Shoigu, the Russian defense minister, just said in the last couple of hours that the situation is heading for uncontrollable escalation. He means the American armed forces moving up to the Ukrainian border in Romania. It's only the 51st Airborne Division, an outfit with a checkered military past, and there's only 4,500 of them, but nonetheless, it's the closest hostile American forces have come to Russian forces at any time since the Second World War. That's important. Make a note of it, that I spoke to you of it this day. He means also that the Russian reinforcements are now almost in place. Within 10 days, Russia will have almost doubled their military strength in the liberated parts of the Ukraine, as they call them, occupied parts of Ukraine, as they're known in Kiev and in Western capitals. More than double the military and more than double the firepower. So the chances of any of the territory taken by Russia being reoccupied by Ukrainian forces is close to zero. But more important, perhaps than that, is that the political situation in the European countries that have declared economic war on Russia is sliding from bad to worse. The Draghi centrist government in Italy has gone, replaced by a populist government of the right, with the new Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni now in place. President Macron has already lost his majority, and mass demonstrations are beginning to break out all over France, and for that matter, all over Germany. But perhaps as significant as any is the uprising taking place in Moldova right now at Chisinau Airport, where mass demonstrations, perhaps the beginning of an insurrection, is threatening to topple the pro-NATO, pro-EU president of Moldova, which is a breakaway from Romania and which has itself lost territory called Transnistria as a breakaway from it. The majority of the people in Transnistria are overwhelmingly 90% or more Russian people. And the political sympathies with at least half of the people in Moldova lie with Moscow rather than with Brussels, with NATO and the EU. So we may be beginning to see tectonic plates moving in places you perhaps have not studied as closely as you might now need to. But first, it's the British domestic situation, which is making headlines for all the wrong reasons all over the world. After this short break, it's the doyen of political scientists from the University of Strathclyde, Professor Sir John Curtis, coming up.